live on the Developer Innovation Day. It's our first ever Developer Innovation Day. I'm A.M. Grabelli, one of your hosts with... You're back.
I'm back. Did you miss me?
I always miss you, Farah.
Well, I'm Farah.
Yes, Farah, one of my co-hosts. And we are bringing you all types of content around. We did Amplify in the morning, a lot of front-end mobile development. We're doing DevOps in the afternoon. We've been talking CodeCatalyst. We just met with that team. And now we're going to get a hands-on demo. We've got two guests with us. Brian, you want to start intros for us, please?
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name's Brian Beach, and I'm the tech lead for our Builder Experience community at AWS.
Very cool.
And I'm Ryan Bachman. I'm a DevOps Specialist SA here at AWS.
Nice, nice. Now, we are live, so I want to remind everybody, if you got questions, get them in chat. I'll get them asked, I promise. But we're just getting hands-on. We're going to start using CodeCatalyst, right, Brian?
Absolutely, yeah. So what I want to do is, you just saw a bunch of information about the capabilities and features of CodeCatalyst. And so now what I want to do is jump in and just do a live demo. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from a blueprint, and then we're going to deploy that. We'll go in and build an application. And my intent here is we're going to do a static website generator as a blueprint for that.
Static websites.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So you might use this to create a blog, or possibly put together documentation for an application that you're building. And so this is a very common application. So we're going to do that. We'll go through the editing process, look at doing that in a dev environment, and then we'll go through the workflow CI/CD process to deploy that and get it deployed to AWS.
I love it.
I'm stoked. Great. I've been thinking about starting my own blog, so maybe I'll
Absolutely.
have a like. Yes,
I would read your blog.
You would.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, maybe I'll know how to do it now.
Yeah, you should. You should. Okay, let's go,
Excellent.
Brian.
All right, yeah, so let's jump in. I'm already logged in here. I'm logged into CodeCatalyst, and I'm logged into my personal space, which is just called Brian Beach. And a space, this is a place to organize your projects. So you could have multiple projects in here, and you can have multiple teammates that are working on those. And so just to set the stage, let's take a look at this. Within my space, if I come over to members, right now I'm the only member of this space. This is a really simple demo. I think there's some things coming later in the day where you're going to see the collaboration features with multiple people engaged in.
Maybe from that guy?
Possibly,
Maybe.
yeah.
I don't know.
Absolutely.
No spoilers.
Nope, no, I don't want to give too much away here. And the other thing that I want to point out is in my space, I have previously registered an AWS account. So this is my private AWS account, where my kind of playground account. And this is what I'm going to deploy to. So I've done that ahead of time. I just want to set stage here so you understand the context of what existed before we started.
And not everybody, I just want to clarify too, not everybody in a project has to have an AWS account, right?
Right, yes.
You have to have one to use CodeCatalyst, right, to deploy.
Yes.
But if I invite Ryan, for instance, and he doesn't have an AWS account, he can still use the features and tools in CodeCatalyst.
Absolutely, yeah, that's correct. He does not need to have an AWS
Yeah,
account
as long as the space is connected, you can invite all the different members to the space and begin collaborating. Cool.
Absolutely, great. So let's jump in. I'm going to come back to projects here, and I'm going to create a new project. Okay, and there's a couple things that I could do. We could start from scratch, and I could start with just an empty project and bring up my development environment and start adding to it. I could also bring my own code. So if maybe I've already got a project out there, there's something out in the world that I want to be able to import, GitHub or something like that, I could do that. Or I could start from a blueprint, which is what we're going to do today. So this has been talked about a bit before. There's lots of different blueprints that we could start from, things like a single page application, React, Vue, Angular, as well as serverless applications, and then a bunch of others. And specifically, I'm looking at the static website. So when we bring that up, it brings up a README describing what that is. And we can see here that this blueprint would allow me to create a static website using Hugo or Jekyll. And I'm going to use Hugo for this. And then I could set up different deployment options. So maybe I want to deploy this to Amplify that we talked about this morning, which is exactly what I'm going to do. Oh, nice. Or if you prefer, you could go to an S3 with CloudFront in front of it as your deployment option. So let's jump in and do that. So I'm going to jump in here. I'll just call this demo 1. All right, the first thing I'm going to do is, this is the account that I want to deploy to. So this is the same one that we looked at earlier that I had set up. And I'm going to deploy to this account. And I've got a couple roles in this account that I'm going to use to handle that deployment. So I'm going to click this admin role. Should never actually do that. It's only good for demos, of course. But I'm running under an admin role. And that's what's going to be used to handle the deployment and create resources in AWS. And then here under advanced, I can come in and make those selections. So again, I'm going to leave Hugo as my default. I'm going to deploy to Northern Virginia. And I'm going to deploy this to Amplify hosting. These are the configurations that they were talking about in the prior session that make these blueprints so powerful. I can come in and pick different options and then tune exactly what I want that project to look like when it's deployed. So I'll leave those defaults and we'll create this project. And it'll take a few seconds for it to go through and render all the different components.
We had a question from chat about IAM and the users within CodeCatalyst. Is it tied to IAM users? So I thought maybe we could talk about Builder ID a little bit.
Yeah,
there.
do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so I mean, the IAM users, or the IAM roles that we assign to projects, or we link to those accounts, right now that's a connection between the CodeCatalyst space and the target IAM role. So when you onboard into CodeCatalyst, that's one of the things that we walk you through setting up, and we have a kind of a default role that works with all our blueprints. So you can kind of go in there and one click have that role that supports all our current blueprints.
But the actual question was around the users. Like,
Right.
They're not using IAM,
Right.
correct?
Right.
Like they're
Correct.
using
Right.
a different sign-in.
Yeah, so right now, as a member of these projects, as long as that project has a connection into the role,
Right.
right now those two are completely decoupled. The builder's ID have the permissions that the project or the space has.
Right. So when you invite somebody into your project to collaborate, they're going to use their Builder ID sign-up to sign in.
Right.
Correct.
Yep.
Cool.
Yep. Excellent. All right, so that project is now created, and if we come in, I'm going to start just touring through what it created. So we'll come into code, and I'll look at the source repository first, and you can see that it created a repository called static website. And you could have multiple repositories here. This blueprint only has one. If we drill into this, you can see the files that are in this Git repository. And if you've worked with Hugo in the past, there's really two important components of this. One is the content folder. This is where you're going to create new content that will go on the site. There's nothing there right now. It's empty. And then there's also the theme. So the theme is what this site will be rendered. What does it look like when the HTML is created? If you haven't worked with one of these generators before, essentially we're going to work in Markdown, and then the generator converts that into HTML and applies a theme to make it look nice. Okay, and in addition, there's a README file that walks you through how to use Hugo and get you started if you're not familiar with it. So I could clone this repository and work on it on my local machine, but of course you heard a little bit about deb environments previously. And so there's a couple options here. We could start with Cloud9. This would launch it right in the browser here. Or I can use a couple other IDEs. I could use VS Code if I wanted to, or any of these JetBrains IDEs. I have VS Code installed on this laptop, so I'm going to use that here. And I'm just going to work right in the main branch. We do, of course, support feature branches, pull requests, and all of that. But I'm going to keep it simple for this
Yeah, we
demo.
just saw feature branch workflow, so
Okay,
let's
great.
YOLO into
Good.
main.
Yeah, absolutely. Jump right in.
I love it.
Okay, so with this launching, you're seeing
vibe.
a few things happening. Across here at the top, you can see that CodeCatalyst is creating my dev environment. And that dev environment is going to run in AWS. This is something that runs within AWS, and then I'm going to actually edit the code in VS Code that's installed locally. And you can see that the AWS toolkit right now is setting up the SSH tunnel. So we've deployed the dev environment in AWS, and then we've set up an SSH tunnel to connect so I can work on it locally. It feels just like I'm working on my local machine, but all of this is happening up in AWS.
If you don't have the VS Toolkit installed, why not? Go install it right now.
Absolutely.
It's awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah. Part of the beauty of doing this is I've now got an environment for every project that I'm working on. If I've got different dependencies, if I've got different versions of, say, Python installed, there's no longer issues with conflicts there.
Nice.
So, cool. So with that, let me just jump in, and we'll get a terminal up here. And let's just do a Hugo version, make sure that Hugo's running. OK, so I've got Hugo version 110 installed. And all right, and so I want to start by just creating a new post. I'm just going to copy and paste this so I don't screw it up. And I'm going to do a Hugo new, and I'm going to create a new post. Remember, there's nothing in my content folder right now. It's empty. And when I do this, Hugo will go and create a new post for me. Okay. And again, this post is really just a markdown file. So the first thing I'm going to do is, this isn't a draft. I want to see it. If we leave it draft, you won't actually see it. It won't get rendered as part of the output. And we'll just keep this as a quick, we'll do maybe hello world for this and make it real simple. Okay. And let's just see that. So I'll do a Hugo serve, and that will start my, we'll start the debug web server, and then I can open that in the browser. And you
Now,
can, yeah.
no tricks up your sleeve here, Brian. You didn't have Hugo installed on your machine,
Yep,
did you?
correct. That is correct. Yeah, so let's dig in and take a look at that.
Okay.
So if we come back here, Hugo is not part of our standard dev image. And there's lots of configuration that I can apply through something called the dev file.
Oh, even in CodeCatalyst, you mean the standard dev image for CodeCatalyst?
Correct, does not
Got it.
install.
Okay.
Yeah, does not include
Not
Hugo.
just your machine, but
Yeah, so I'm sorry, yeah, maybe I misunderstood your original question.
No,
So,
no.
so right, Hugo is not installed on my local laptop. This is happening inside the dev environment.
Yeah.
Right, so this is happening within AWS. And in addition, Hugo is not actually part of that standard image. Right,
interesting.
there's lots of dev tools installed on there. Hugo wasn't one of them. But I still have a lot of control and ability to configure here. And so let's take a look at how that works. That comes from this thing called the dev file. And when we dig into this, you can see that first, this is a container that's defined for this environment. Right? This is what I'm working in, is this first container here. And then I've added some additional commands. And there's two important ones here. The first one is going to download Hugo. Right, that's just going to pull it down, and then the second one installs it and uncompresses it into my bin folder. And then there's some events. So post start, once this container starts up, I want to go and add these additional tools that weren't part of it. And so this says download Hugo and install Hugo.
Very cool. I see one of these commands says exec, so you're running some bash script
Exactly.
here.
Yep.
Are there other commands, Brian or Ryan?
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of things that you can do with these dev files. One of the things that we can do here is you could also add or extend these environments through adding additional containers that might have
nice.
different tools or services. So the one I commonly like is, running Dynamo local. Amazon produces an official, DynamoDB local container, and you can go ahead and add that to a dev environment. And so if you're developing a serverless application or something that relied on Dynamo, you can go ahead and put that in your environment and allow your developers to test against it and verify the code before they push to main.
Cool.
Excellent. Yeah. And there's a lot more you can do. You can check out devfile.io. It will describe all the configuration options that are
nice.
available. Okay. So my site's up and running. You can see here this is running on localhost. So this is being served back over that SSH tunnel. And again, the toolkit's taking care of setting all this up for you. So it feels like you're developing locally, even though this is happening within AWS. So to make this a little more interesting, I'm just going to grab a couple posts that I've pre-created. This is a series of 6 blog posts that we put out shortly after CodeCatalyst was released, and it walks you through all
Your
the
blogs, Farah?
Yeah, he's getting started for me.
That's nice. Wow, you got Brian working for you already? Wow.
Yeah, so this will walk you through all the major features of CodeCatalyst and explain how each of those pieces work. So this is available on the AWS DevOps blog, but I've added these 6 posts here as well, just so we have something a little more meaningful than my simple Hello World application as we deploy this. So that's just a very quick overview of what we can do with the dev environment and what that experience feels like. So let's commit this. I'm going to push this back. I'm going to commit this and push it back up into CodeCatalyst.
But that happened so quick. Like that was just like dropped them over there. That
Absolutely.
was like, wow.
Yeah. And if you pause and think about that, right, this dev file has configured the whole environment for me and taken care of a lot of that. Imagine that you've got a big team. People are coming on and off the team as you work over time, and maybe you've added some consultants, and they can just immediately be productive. Right? As soon as they touch this, their whole environment's set up, all the tools, just the experience we had today, can be how everyone on your team is working. Right? I remember the job before this, I was working for a big accounting firm, and I was there for about 3 weeks before I had a machine that could be productive on.
Right.
All right, getting tools installed, chasing people down, trying to understand how to get the build to work.
It's a much better experience when you get started too, and
Yeah.
you can feel productive right away. Within, when you're sitting there feeling like, you can't really do anything to be effective.
Yeah,
Or
such
you
a
feel
game
like
changer.
me and you just feel more and more like a fraud every day that you can't get your machine working and that they shouldn't have hired you. And you're like, oh, well, I should be able to just get this set up, shouldn't I? And it's because the run book they gave you is so out of date that
Yep.
nobody's touched it in 6
Yeah.
years. And it's really not your fault.
Yep.
It's not your fault, Alan Michael. It's not.
Well, you can use
Speaking of
CodeCatalyst
myself.
now, and you'll be productive. So there
Yes, yes. And you don't have to feel bad about yourself
Exactly.
anymore.
Exactly. Yeah, and this is a very trivial example, just adding a couple commands, but imagine a more complex environment where maybe I've got a few other containers, a Postgres database, and other things that are part of my project, and I can codify all of that in this dev file.
We've got an interesting question from chat. Is CodeCatalyst setting up an EC2 instance for each dev, and then is it just disappearing after you stop using it?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a little bit behind the scenes. What these dev environments run on, they are container-based, and we do need hosts to run those containers, but that's kind of the sausage making of like what happens. All you really need to know is there's a container provision for your dev environment,
right,
and they are intended to be very ephemeral, right? And that's where the power of the dev files come in, right? You need a new dev environment, you go ahead and create it for your branch, you do your work, you commit it, and then destroy, and know your work will be preserved.
And just to clarify too, chat is talking about, is this Cloud9? Cloud9 is an option, but we're actually not using Cloud9. Brian, you're using VS
Yeah,
Code.
so think of the distinction is sort of the IDE that you're using to handle the development and then where that's happening. So
right.
The dev environment describes where that's happening. I could have used Cloud9
yes.
with my dev environment rather than Visual Studio. But in both cases, there's going to be two components of it. The front end piece that I'm actually working in the IDE and the back end where that's occurring.
Yes, and it connects through the VS Toolkit, or the AWS VS Toolkit, I believe over SSH. There's support in VS Code for connecting to remote development environments, and it's taking advantage of that.
You can see that right at the bottom of my screen here.
Yes, yeah.
That SSH tunnel.
Really, all of the terminal commands that you're running are happening on that dev environment. I think that's kind of an for me, that's how I try to visualize it, right? Like you're typing in the editor itself, that's happening locally, and then in the terminal, when you run a command, that's happening over SSH.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you no longer have a need for like these powerful machines on the front end, right? Like if you
right.
do Cloud9, I can code in CodeCatalyst from my cell phone, right? Just over a browser base if I decided to go Cloud9.
Chad is pleased with this, by the way. They're excited.
Chad likes it?
People are happy.
Yeah,
Great.
yeah,
Beautiful.
yes.
Very good. All right,
Great job, team.
Thanks, Chad.
I'm going to leave the IDE and head back into CodeCatalyst. And so this is where we left off before. We were looking at the repository. And if we come over to the commits, we should see two now. Right, one of them 12 minutes ago was the initial commit when the blueprint created the project. That caused the first commit. And then there was just this demo that I did a moment ago that made the second commit. So we can come in and take a look at that. And you can see, of course, these are the new posts that I've added as part of the process. So let's jump down. The other thing I want to talk about is the workflow that's going to deploy this. So I'm going to come down under CI/CD, and we'll look at the workflow. And the blueprint has created just this single workflow for me. And on push, it's called on push, build, and deploy. And you can see there's been two recent runs. Again, there were two commits. Every time there's a commit, there's a run. So the first one ran. There was nothing to actually display. It just put out the theme with no content in it. And now there's the second one a few minutes ago that has deployed the changes we just made. OK, so let's take a look at this workflow. You can see from the top, we start with the source. And this is going to be triggered on a commit to main. And then it's going to run the following steps. We're going to ultimately use CDK, which we talked about CDK a little bit earlier. I think there's more coming on that later. But we're going to use CDK to handle the deployment. And
nice.
so two things are going to happen. First, the CDK bootstrap is going to run. That's just going to make sure that my account is set up and that everything's there for CDK to run later on. And then I'm going to run a build. And the build steps look very much like what I was doing in the dev file to set up my dev environment. I'm going to download Hugo. I'm going to install Hugo. And then I'm going to run the Hugo command that's going to take the markdown files that we were looking at and render those as HTML. And it's just going to put that in a CDK public folder where CDK can find it and deploy it in the next step. And then the final step of this is that CDK is going to run and handle my deployment. So if we come over here, you can see all the logs of the CDK deployment that ran. And ultimately, it has deployed this to Amplify hosting. So if I click on this link that's rendered for me, here's my site that we were just looking at, my first post that we created along with those 6 entries that I put in here. The same thing we were seeing in my dev environment, but now I'm running this from Amplify.
No local host.
Exactly.
No local host up in that, right? So this is actually another one of those productivity kind of collaboration things that we were talking about in the last segment too, that I like to point out about this is getting changes from your local dev environment, which saying local dev environment in the terms of CodeCatalyst is really doing some mental gymnastics for me right now. But getting those changes to like something like a website where I can share it with the people that I'm working with has always been a challenge, right? It's gotten easier over the years with things like serverless, oh, I've got API gateway I can stand up, real quick, or just drop it into S3. But this is like super simple, right?
Yeah.
Getting a prototype or getting like the changes or features into, and I got to call out, Brian, you even named your AWS account that you loaded into CodeCatalyst development,
Yep.
which you could have multiple AWS accounts tied
Yes.
to the same one.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we come back to this workflow, right, again, this is a very simple workflow for a blog. You're probably not going to go through multiple test stages at least for my blog anyway. I'm not that important. But if this were a real application, maybe the docs for an important application that we've been working on, I might have multiple steps here.
Yeah.
And so I could have created multiple steps in my workflow to deploy to different environments and do some testing along the way. Or I could base this on a branch logic and say, I've got a development branch where we're going to make all of our changes. That's going to push to a dev environment, and then we'll merge that into main, and that will push to production.
Yeah.
And so we can set all those scenarios up here. with
Especially
those
as a
different
front-end
environments.
dev, getting those staged changes to a place where you can share with your team is sometimes challenging. And you just showed us. You get an Amplify hosting URL like in
Yeah,
minutes.
we've been talking for 20 minutes, maybe 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're able to do quite a bit really quickly.
That's
Yeah,
a
people are
bizarre-
saying that we can't tell our managers because they'll have their work done before lunch, and so they want to make it sure it looks like they're taking a little bit longer.
Yeah. And it's really about being able to focus on the right things. I didn't spend a lot of time setting up my dev environment. I didn't go and run a bunch of tools to get things installed and set up Hugo and all the things that you would normally do, probably looking at a wiki or similar to figure out how to handle that.
So say I have an existing GitHub project that repo that I want to use. Could I do that in CodeCatalyst?
Yeah. So when we created this project, there were 3 different options. I could start with an empty project, I could import one, or I could start from one of these blueprints. So absolutely, yeah, you can do that. Great. So we've got a couple more minutes. So let's dig in a bit into this workflow and look at how it actually works. Maybe go in and edit it.
Ooh, add some steps to the workflow?
Yeah, let's talk about how we could expand this and extend it. So I'm going to go into edit mode here. And first and foremost, you see, this is the definition of my workflow. It's configured as YAML, and it is part of my source code. So this is checked in as part of the source. But I find it a little easier to work with a visual designer. So I'm going to bring up the visual designer. It's going to look just like the thing we were looking at earlier with each of the steps. And I can come in and take a look at how each of these is configured. So build task, this is a fairly generic task that allows me to set up the commands that I want to be able to run. Okay. So first, you can see there's no environment. There's nothing to deploy here. I'm just handling the build. There's another action within this workflow that's going to do the deployment. And here's the steps that are running. So you can see all the individual command line steps that I want to run as part of that build, which again is install Hugo and then run the Hugo command to render. The next step in here is CDK deploy, and this is a much less generic step than a build where I'm going to give it commands. This knows exactly what it needs to do. This is just for deploying CDK projects. And if we come and look at the configuration of this one, well, now you can see here's that development account we were looking at earlier, and it's saying this is where I want to put it. If I had multiple CDK deploys happening here, I would just change this. And so I might have a dev and a prod, or maybe a test along the way, and you just set them here, and that's how you determine where it's going to deploy to. Okay, and there's nothing else I need to tell it, because it knows this is a CDK deploy step, and this is a CDK project, so it understands what it needs to do. In addition, we could add additional components to this. So let's come in and add some actions. And there's a bunch of actions that CodeCatalyst supplies. So you see things like the build and test. These are those fairly generic actions that let me put a series of command line steps in to configure it. And then a bunch of other generally AWS-related tasks, things like deploying with SAM, deploying to our container registry. There's one here for Amplify hosting, ECS, CloudFormation, all the things that you would expect to see as part of a workflow for an AWS application. But we're not limited to just these. If there are things that you want to do that you're not finding, CodeCatalyst also supports the vast majority of GitHub actions. So I can use these as well. And there's a bunch that we've curated as part of the list that you can pick from. And then there's one at the top here that's just the generic GitHub action. And if you go up to the GitHub Actions Marketplace, there'll be a little YAML that you could copy and paste and just put into here to essentially use that action.
Nice.
So let's, for the sake of demo purposes, let's just add a linter. I mean, generally, a Hugo site Markdown isn't something that you would heavily lint and expect to find things in, but it will still give you some best practices. Superlinter includes a ton of different linters, including just general English language suggestions and stuff like that. So it is relevant. So I'm going to create that. And if we come look at the configuration here, all this is doing is a using statement for a GitHub action. So it's a little more than that I need to use this one or any other GitHub action. If we had a little more time, I would probably tune this and tell it exactly which linters I want to use so it's not running all of them. And I would likely tell it to look just at a subset of my code. I don't want to necessarily lint everything. For example, the theme probably doesn't make sense for me to go and lint someone else's theme that I've imported. I'm just going to leave the defaults here. And of course, I can set up precedence with depends on in the workflow. So I'll come down here to my deploy, and I'll say, well, I only want to deploy this if the linter doesn't find any issues. If it does, I want to break this build and stop, so we can come in and fix it. Yep, exactly.
Stop the pipeline.
So I'll validate that, and then we can commit that change. And again, this is going to get saved as YAML in my source code.
Nice. Can we repurpose stop the presses for like breaking a pipeline? Can we just start yelling that out?
In this case, I think that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Oh yeah, because you are publishing.
Yeah.
Wow. That was unintentional.
Well done.
Look at that.
I'm going to claim it, though. I meant to. Admit the connection there.
So we can see as soon as I committed that, right, that caused another commit to my source repository. And then there's another run that has kicked off. And you can see there's the previous run here. This was the last one that ran 9 minutes ago. And then there's another one coming through. And all three of these actions are executing in parallel. And making sure the CDK is bootstrapped, handling the build, and then linting the application before it deploys it.
Now, we mentioned dev files a couple times, and I just wanted to point out and ask you all a little bit more. That's not an necessarily AWS only thing, right? That's an open standard.
Right, yeah.
Is that right?
Open standard, yeah, devfile.io. There's a lot of different organizations that have adopted dev files to help model your dev environment. Yep.
Okay, cool. So nice to hear we're using an open standard as well that
absolutely,
people can expect. Very cool.
You can read a lot about this at devfile.io.
Very
Give you all the
nice.
details.
Very nice. Cool.
All right.
We got to start wrapping up, don't we, Farah?
I know, but I'm curious. This seems to do so much. What is your favorite feature of CodeCatalyst?
I think the dev environments and the ability, the ability just to get running so quickly and not spend time trying to install tools.
Yeah, and for me, I think it's the blueprints a little bit, right? Like the options that they provide, a little bit of flexibility, but helping me get started, and then starting there and then jumping into the code and extending it how I need to fit my use case. So, yeah.
Well, we got some questions coming in from chat, but we're coming up on time. This is not our last CodeCatalyst segment, so maybe we'll save some of those for the next segment. We want to push people to go check out this learn more and get started for free QR code we've got here too. Anything else that you'd like to tell the audience to do?
No, CodeCatalyst.aws and go ahead and sign up and get building.